Section 50 of the Junior Classics Volume 9 Stories of Today. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. The Rose and the Ring. How Hedzoff rode back again to King Giglio. By William M. Thackeray. Captain Hedzoff rode away when King Padella uttered this cruel command, having done his duty in delivering the message with which his royal master had entrusted him. Of course he was very sorry for Rosalba, but what could he do? So he returned to King Giglio's camp and found the young monarch in a disturbed state of mind, smoking cigars in the royal tent. His Majesty's agitation was not appeased by the news that was brought by his ambassador. The brutal, ruthless, ruffian royal wretch, Giglio exclaimed, as England's Posey has well remarked. The man that lays his hand upon a woman, save in the way of kindness, is a villain. Ha, Hedzoff! That he is, your majesty, said the attendant. And didst thou see her flung into the oil? And didn't the soothing oil, the emollient oil, refuse to boil, good Hedzoff, and to spoil the fairest lady ever eyes did look on? Faith, good my liege, I had no heart to look and see a beauteous lady boiling down. I took your royal message to Padella, and bore his back to you. I told him you would hold Prince Bublo answerable. He only said that he had 20 sons as good as Bublo, and forthwith he bade the ruthless executioners proceed. "O cruel father! O unhappy son!" cried the king. "Go, some of you, and bring Prince Bublo hither." Bublo was brought in chains, looking very uncomfortable. Though a prisoner, he had been tolerably happy, perhaps because his mind was at rest, and all the fighting was over, and he was playing at marbles with his guards when the king sent for him. "Oh, my poor Bublo," said his majesty, with looks of infinite compassion, "hast thou heard the news?" For you see, Giglio wanted to break the thing gently to the prince. "Thy brutal father has condemned Rosalba, put her to death, Prince Bublo." "What? Killed Betsinda? Boo hoo hoo!" cried out Bublo. "Betsinda, pretty Betsinda, dear Betsinda? She was the dearest little girl in the world. I love her better 20,000 times even than Angelica." And he went on expressing his grief in so hearty and unaffected a manner that the king was quite touched by it, and said, shaking Bublo's hand, that he wished he had known Bublo sooner. Bublo, quite unconsciously, and meaning for the best, offered to come and sit with his majesty, and smoke a cigar with him, and console him. The royal kindness supplied Bublo with a cigar. He had not had one, he said, since he was taken prisoner. And now think what must have been the feelings of the most merciful of monarchs, when he informed his prisoner that, in consequence of King Padella's cruel and dastardly behavior to Rosalba, Prince Bublo must instantly be executed. The noble Giglio could not restrain his tears, nor could the grenadiers, nor the officers, nor could Bublo himself. when the matter was explained to him, and he was brought to understand that his Majesty's promise, of course, was above everything, and Booble must submit. So poor Booble was led out, Hedzoff trying to console him by pointing out that if he had won the battle of Bombardero, he might have hanged Prince Giglio. Yes, but that is no comfort to me now, said poor Booble, nor indeed was it, poor fellow. He was told the business would be done the next morning at 8, and was taken back to his dungeon, where every attention was paid to him. The gaoler's wife sent him tea, and the turnkey's daughter begged him to write his name in her album, where a many gentlemen had wrote it on like occasions. Bother your album, says Booble. The undertaker came and measured him for the handsomest coffin which money could buy. Even this didn't console Boblo. The cook brought him dishes which he once used to like, but he wouldn't touch them. He sat down and began writing an adieu to Angelica, as the clock always kept ticking, and the hands drawing nearer to next morning. The barber came in at night and offered to shave him for the next day. Prince Booble kicked him away and went on writing a few words to Prince Angelica, as the clock kept always ticking and the hands hopping nearer and nearer to next morning. He got up on the top of a hat box, on the top of a chair, on the top of his bed, on the top of his table, and looked out to see whether he might escape, as the clock kept always ticking, and the hands drawing nearer and nearer and nearer. But looking out the window was one thing, and jumping another, and the town clock struck 7, so he got into bed for a little sleep. But the gaoler came and woke him, and said, "Get up, your royal highness, if you please, it's 10 minutes to 8. So poor Booble got up. He had gone to bed in his clothes, the lazy boy, and he shook himself and said he didn't mind about dressing, or having any breakfast, thank you. And he saw the soldiers who had come for him. "Lead on," he said, and they led the way, deeply affected that they came into the courtyard and out into the square, and there was King Giglio come to take leave of him, and his Majesty most kindly shook hands with him, and the gloomy procession marched on, when, hark! Ha, wara, wara, a war! A roar of wild beasts was heard, and who should come riding into town, frightening away the boys and even the beadle and policeman, but Rosalba. The fact is that when Captain Hedzoff entered into the court of Snapdragon Castle and was discoursing with King Padella, the lions made a dash at the open gate, gobbled up the 6 beef eaters in a jiffy, and away they went with Rosalba on the back of one of them, and they carried her turn and turn about till they came to the city where Prince Giglio's army was encamped. When the king heard of the queen's arrival, you may think how he rushed out of his breakfast room to hand her Majesty off her lion. The lions were grown as fat as pigs now, having had Habanero and all those beef eaters, and were so tame anybody might pat them. When Giglio knelt most gracefully and helped the Princess, Booble, for his part, rushed up and kissed the lion. He flung his arms round the forest monarch. He hugged him and laughed and cried for joy. "Oh, you darling old beast! Oh, how glad I am to see you! And the dear, dear Bets! That is Rosalba." "What, is it you, poor Bublo?" said the queen. "Oh, how glad I am to see you!" And she gave her hand to kiss. King Giglio slapped him most kindly on the back, and said, "Bublo, my boy, I am delighted for your sake that Her Majesty has arrived." "So am I," said Bublo, "and you know why." Captain Hedzoff here came up. "Sir, it is 8:30. Shall we proceed with the execution?" "Execution for what?" asked Bublo. "An officer only knows his orders," replied Captain Hedzoff, showing his warrant, on which His Majesty King Giglio, smiling, said, Prince Bublo was reprieved this time, and most graciously invited him to breakfast. End of section 50. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC.
Section 51 of the Junior Classics, Volume 9, Stories of Today. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by JodiS, Seaside Park, New Jersey. The Rose and the Ring, How a Tremendous Battle Took Place and Who Won It, by William M. Thackeray. As soon as King Padella heard what we know already, that his victim, the lovely Rosalba, had escaped him, His Majesty's fury knew no bounds, and he pitched the Lord Chancellor, Lord Chamberlain, and every officer of the crown whom he could set his eyes on into the cauldron of boiling oil prepared for the princess. Then he ordered out his whole army, horse, foot, and artillery, and set forth at the head of an innumerable host, and I should think 20,000 drummers, trumpeters, and fifers. King Giglio's advance guard, you may be sure, kept that monarch acquainted with the enemy's dealings, and he was in no wise disconcerted. He was much too polite to alarm the princess, his lovely guest, with any unnecessary rumors of battles impending. On the contrary, he did everything to amuse and divert her, gave her a most elegant breakfast, dinner, lunch, and got up a ball for her that evening, when he danced with her every single dance. Poor Bulbo was taken into favor again, and allowed to go quite free now. He had new clothes given him, was called my good cousin by His Majesty, and was treated with the greatest distinction by everybody. But it was easy to see he was very melancholy. The fact is, the sight of Betsinda, who looked perfectly lovely in an elegant new dress, set poor Bulbo frantic in love with her again. And he never thought about Angelica, now Princess Bulba, whom he had left at home, and who, as we know, did not care much about him. The king danced the 25th polka with Rosalba, remarked with wonder the ring she wore, and then Rosalba told him how he had got it from Gruffanuff, who no doubt had picked it up when Angelica flung it away. Yes, says the fairy Blackstick, who had come to see the young people, and who had very likely certain plans regarding them. That ring I gave the queen, Giglio's mother, who was not, saving her presence, a very wise woman. It is enchanted, and whoever wears it looks beautiful in the eyes of the world. I made poor Prince Bulbo, when he was christened, the present of a rose, which made him look handsome when he had it, but he gave it to Angelica, who instantly looked beautiful again, whilst Bulbo relapsed into his natural plainness. Rosalba needs no ring, I am sure, says Giglio with a low bow. She is beautiful enough in my eyes, without any enchanted aid. Oh, sir, said Rosalba. Take off the ring and try, said the king, and resolutely drew the ring off her finger. In his eyes she looked just as handsome as before. The king was thinking of throwing the ring away, as it was so dangerous and made all the people so mad about Rosalba. But being a prince of great humor, and good humor too, he cast eyes upon a poor youth who happened to be looking on very disconsolately, and said, Bulbo, my poor lad, come and try on this ring. The Princess Rosalba makes it a present to you. The magic properties of this ring were uncommonly strong, for no sooner had Bulbo put it on, but lo and behold, he appeared a personable, agreeable young prince enough, with a fine complexion, fair hair, rather stout, and with bandy legs, but these were encased in such a beautiful pair of yellow morocco boots that nobody remarked about them. And Bulbo's spirits rose up almost immediately after he had looked in the glass and talked to their majesties in most lively, agreeable manner, and danced opposite the Queen with one of the prettiest maids of honor, and after looking at Her Majesty could not help saying, "How very odd! She is very pretty, but not so extraordinarily handsome." "Oh no, by no means," says the maid of honor. "But what care I, dear sir," says the Queen, who overheard them, "if you think I am good-looking enough?" His Majesty's glance in reply in this affectionate speech was such that no painter could draw it. The fairy Blackstick said, "Bless you, my darling children, and you are united and happy. And now you see what I said from the first, that a little misfortune has done you both good. You, Giglio, had been bred in prosperity, would scarcely have learned to read and write. You would have been idle and extravagant, and could not have been a good king, as now you will be. You, Rosalba, would have been so flattered that your little head might have been turned like Angelica's, who thought herself too good for Giglio." "As if anybody could be good enough for him," cried Rosalba. "Oh, you darling," says Giglio, and so she was, and he was just holding out his arms in order to give her a hug before the whole company, when a messenger came rushing in and said, "My lord, the enemy." "To arms," cries Giglio. "Oh, mercy," says Rosalba, and fainted of course. He snatched one kiss from her lips and rushed forth to the field of battle. The fairy had provided King Giglio with a suit of armor which was not only embroidered all over with jewels and blinding to your eyes to look at, but was waterproof, gunproof, and swordproof, so that in the midst of the very hottest battles His Majesty rode about as calmly as if he had been a British grenadier at Alma. Were I engaged in fighting for my country, I should like such an armor as Prince Giglio wore, but you know, he was a prince of a fairy tale, and they always have these wonderful things. Besides the fairy armor, the prince had a fairy horse, which would gallop at any pace you please, and a fairy sword which would lengthen and run through a whole regiment and enemies at once. With such a weapon at command, I wonder, for my part, he thought of ordering his army out. But forth they all came, in magnificent new uniforms, Hedzoff and the prince's 2 college friends each commanding a division, and His Majesty prancing in person at the head of all of them. Ah, if I had a pen of Sir Archibald Alison, my dear friends, would I not now entertain you with the account of the most tremendous shindy? Should not fine blows be struck, dreadful wounds be delivered, arrows darken the air, cannon-balls crash through the battalions, cavalry charge infantry, infantry pitch into cavalry, bugles blow, drums beat, horses neigh, fifes sing, soldiers roar, swear, hooray. Officers should shout, "Forward, my men! This way, lads! Give it to 'em, boys! Fight for King Giglio and the cause of right! King Padella forever!" Would I not describe all this, I say, and in the very finest language too? But this humble pen does not possess the skill necessary for the description of combats. In a word, the overthrow of King Padella's army was so complete, if they had been Russians, you could not have wished them to be more utterly smashed and confounded. As for the usurping monarch, having performed acts of valor much more considerable than could be expected of a royal ruffian and usurper, who had such a bad cause, and who was so cruel to women, as for King Padella, I say, when his army ran away, the king ran away too, kicking his first general, Prince Punchikoff, from his saddle and galloping away on the prince's horse, having indeed had 25 or 26 of his own shot under him. Hedzoff coming up and finding Punchikoff down, as you may imagine, very speedily disposed of him. Meanwhile, King Padella was scampering off as hard as his horse could lay legs to ground. Fast as he scampered, I promise you somebody else galloped faster, and that individual, as you no doubt are aware, was the royal Giglio, who kept bawling out, "Stay, traitor, turn, miscreant, and defend thyself. Stand, tyrant, coward, ruffian, royal wretch, till I cut thy ugly head from thy usurping shoulders." And with his fairy sword, which elongated itself at will, His Majesty kept poking and prodding Padella in the back until the wicked monarch roared with anguish. When he was fairly brought to bay, Padella turned and dealt Prince Giglio with a prodigious crack over the sconce with his battle-axe, a most enormous weapon, which had cut down I don't know how many regiments in the course of the afternoon. But law bless you, though the blow fell right down on His Majesty's helmet, it made no more impression than if Padella had struck him with a pat of butter. His battle-axe crumpled up into Padella's hand, and the royal Giglio laughed for very scorn of the impotent efforts of the atrocious usurper. At the ill success of his blow, the Crim-Tartar monarch was justly irritated. "If," he says to Giglio, "you ride a fairy horse and wear fairy armor, what on earth is the use of my hitting you? I may as well give myself up a prisoner at once. Your Majesty won't, I suppose, but be mean as to strike a poor fellow who can't strike again? The justice of Padella's remark struck the magnanimous Giglio. "Do you yield yourself a prisoner, Padella?" says he. "Of course I do," says Padella. "Do you acknowledge Rosalba as your rightful queen, and give up the crown and all your treasures to your rightful mistress?" "If I must, I must," said Padella, who was naturally very sulky. By the time King Giglio's aides de camp had come up, whom his majesty ordered to bind the prisoner, and they tied his hands behind him, and bound his legs tight under his horse, having set him with his face to the tail, and in this fashion he was led back to King Giglio's quarters, and thrust into the very dungeon where young Bulbo had been confined. Padella, who was a very different person in the depth of distress to Padella, the proud wearer of the Crim Tartary crown, was now most affectionately and earnestly asked to see his son, his dear eldest boy, his darling Bulbo, and that good-natured young man never once reproached his haughty parent for his unkind conduct the day before, when he would have left Bulbo to be shot under without any pity, but came to see his father, and spoke to him through the grating of the door, beyond which he was not allowed to go, and brought him some sandwiches from the grand supper which his majesty was giving above stairs in honor of the brilliant victory that had just been achieved. "I cannot stay with you long, sir," says Bulbo, who was in his best ball dress, as he handed his father in the prog. "I am engaged to dance the next quadrille with Her Majesty Queen Rosalba, and I hear the fiddles playing at this very moment." So Bulbo went back to the ballroom, and the wretched Padella ate his solitary supper in silence and tears. All was now in joy in King Giglio's circle. Dancing, feasting, fun, illuminations, and jollifications of all sorts ensued. The people through whose villages they passed were ordered to illuminate their cottages at night and scatter flowers on the roads during the day. They were requested, and I promise you did not like to refuse, to serve the troops liberally with eatables and wine. Besides, the army was enriched by the immense quantity of plunder which they found in King Padella's camp, and taken from his soldiers, who, after they had given up everything, were allowed to fraternize with the conquerors, and the united forces marched back by easy stages toward King Giglio's capital, his royal banner and that of Queen Rosalba's being carried in front of the troops. Hedzoff was made a duke and the field marshal. Smith and Jones were promoted to be earls, and the Crim Tartar Order of the Pumpkin of the Paphlagonian decoration of the cucumber was freely distributed by their majesties to the army. Queen Rosalba wore the Paphlagonian ribbon of the cucumber across her riding habit, whilst King Giglio never appeared without the grand cordon of the pumpkin. How the people cheered them as they rode along side by side! They were pronounced to be the handsomest couple ever seen, that was a matter of course, but they really were very handsome, and had they been otherwise would have looked so, they were so happy. Their majesties were never separated during the whole day, but breakfasted, dined, and supped together always, and rode side by side, interchanging elegant compliments, and indulging in the most delightful conversation. At night Her Majesty's ladies of honour, who had all rallied round her in the day after King Padella's defeat, came and conducted her to the apartments prepared for her, whilst King Giglio, surrounded by his gentlemen, withdrew to his own royal quarters. It was agreed they should be married as soon as they reached the capital, and orders were dispatched to the Archbishop of Blombodinga to hold himself in readiness to perform the interesting ceremony. Duke Hedzoff carried the message and gave instructions to have the royal castle splendidly refurnished and painted afresh. The Duke seized Glumbosa, the ex-prime minister, and made him refund that considerable sum of money which the old scoundrel had secreted out of the late king's treasure. He also clapped Valoroso into prison, who, by the way, had been dethroned for some considerable period past, and when the ex-monarch weakly remonstrated, Hedzoff said, "A soldier, sir, knows but his duty, and my orders are to lock you up along with the ex-king Padella, whom I have brought hither a prisoner under a guard." So these two ex-royal personages were sent for a year to the House of Correction, and thereafter were obliged to become monks of the severest order of flagellants, in which state, by fasting, by vigils, by flogging, which they administered to one another, humbly but resolutely, no doubt they exhibited a repentance for their past misdeeds, usurpations, and private and public crimes. As for Glumboso, that rogue was sent to the galleys, and never had an opportunity to steal any more. End of section 51.
Section number 52 of the Junior Classics, Volume 9, Stories of Today. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lola, Janie. The Rose and the Ring, Part 18, How They All Journeyed Back to the Capital. The fairy Blackstick, by whose means this young king and queen had certainly won their respective crowns back, would come not unfrequently to pay them a little visit, as they were riding in their triumphal progress towards Giglio's capital, change her wand into a pony, and travel by their majesty's side, giving them the very best advice. I am not sure that King Giglio did not think the fairy and her advice rather a bore, fancying it his own valor and merits which had put him on his throne and conquered Pratibha, and, in fine, I hear he rather gave himself airs towards his best friend and patroness. She exhorted him to deal justly by his subjects, to draw mildly on the taxes, never to break his promise when he had once given it, and in all respects be a good king. A good king, my dear fairy? Cried Rosalba. Of course he will. Break his promise? Can you fancy my Giglio would ever do anything so improper, so unlike him? No, never. And she looked fondly towards Giglio, whom she thought a pattern of perfection. Why is Fairy Blackstick always advising me and telling me how to manage my government and warning me to keep my word? Does she suppose that I am not a man of sense, a man of honor? Asks Giglio testily. Methinks she rather presumes upon her position. Hush, dear Giglio, says Rosalba. You know Blackstick has been very kind to us, and we must not offend her. But the fairy was not listening to Giglio's testy observations. She had fallen back, and was trotting on her pony now by Master Bulbo's side, who rode a donkey, and made himself generally beloved in the army by his cheerfulness, kindness, and good humor to everybody. He was eager to see his darling Angelica. He thought there never was such a charming being. Blackstick did not tell him it was the possession of the magic rose that made Angelica so lovely in his eyes. She brought him the very best accounts of his little wife, whose misfortunes and humiliations had indeed very greatly improved her, and you see she could whisk off on her wand 100 miles in a minute, and be back in no time, and so carry polite messages from Bulbo to Angelica, and from Angelica to Bulbo, and comfort that young man upon his journey. When the royal party arrived at last stage before you reach Bloombodinga, who should be in waiting in her carriage there with her lady of honor by her side, but the Princess Angelica? She rushed into her husband's arms, scarcely stopping to make a passing curtsy to the king and queen. She had no eyes but for Bulbo, who appeared perfectly lovely to her on account of the fairy ring which he wore, whilst she herself, wearing the magic rose in her bonnet, seemed entirely beautiful to the enraptured Bulbo. A splendid luncheon was served to the royal party, of which the Archbishop, the Chancellor, Duke Hedzoff, Countess Gruffanuff, and all of our friends partook, the fairy Blackstick being seated to the left of King Giglio, with Bulbo and Angelica beside her. You could hear the joy bells ringing in the capital, and the guns which the citizens were firing off in honor of their majesties. What can have induced that hideous old Gruffanuff to dress herself up in such an absurd way? Did you ask her to be your bridesmaid, my dear? Says Giglio to Rosalba. What a figure of fun Gruffy is! Gruffy was seated opposite their majesties, between the Archbishop and the Lord Chancellor, and a figure of fun she certainly was, for she was dressed in a low white silk dress with lace over, a wreath of white roses on her wig, a splendid lace veil, and her yellow old neck was covered with diamonds. She ogled the king in such a manner that his majesty burst out laughing. 11 o'clock, cries Giglio, as the great cathedral bell of Bloombadinga tolled that hour. Gentlemen and ladies, we must be starting. Archbishop, you must be at church, I think before 12? We must be at church before 12, sighs out Gruffanuff in a languishing voice, hiding her old face behind her fan. And then I shall be the happiest man in my dominions, cried Giglio, with an elegant bow to the blushing Rosalba. Oh, my Giglio, oh, my dear Giglio, exclaims Gruffanuff, and can it be that this happy moment at length has arrived? Of course it has arrived, says the king, and that I am about to become the enraptured bride of my adored Giglio, continues Gruffanuff. Lend me a smelling bottle, somebody. I certainly shall faint with joy. You, my bride, roars out Giglio. You marry my prince, cried poor little Rosalba. Pooh! Nonsense, the woman's mad, exclaimed the king, and all the courtiers exhibited by their countenances and expressions marks of surprise or ridicule or incredulity or wonder. I should like to know who else is going to be married if I am not, shrieks out Gruffanuff. I should like to know if King Giglio is a gentleman, and if there's such a thing as justice in Phlegonia. Lord Chancellor, my Lord Archbishop, will your lordships sit by and see a poor, fond, confiding, tender creature put upon? Has not Prince Giglio promised to marry his Barbara? Is not this Giglio's signature? Does not this paper declare that he is mine, and only mine? And she handed to his grace the Archbishop the document which the prince signed that evening when she wore the magic ring, and Giglio drank so much champagne. And the old Archbishop, taking out his glasses, read, "This is to give notice that I, Giglio, only son of Savio, King of Phlegonia, hereby promise to marry the charming Barbara Griselda, Countess Gruffanuff, and widow of the late Jenkins Gruffanuff, Esquire." Says the Archbishop. The document is certainly a document. Pooh, says the Lord Chancellor. The signature is not in His Majesty's handwriting. Indeed, since his studies at Bosphorus, Giglio has made an immense improvement in calligraphy. Is it your handwriting, Giglio? Cried the fairy Blackstick with an awful severity of countenance. Yes, poor Giglio gasps out. I had quite forgotten the confounded paper. She can't mean to hold me by it. You old wretch, what will you take to let me off? Help the queen, someone, Her Majesty has fainted. Chop off her head, smother the old witch, pitch her into the river, exclaimed the impetuous Hedzoff, the ardent Smith, and the faithful Jones. But Gruffanuff flung her arms round the Archbishop's neck and bellowed out, "Justice, justice, my Lord Chancellor," so loudly that her piercing shrieks caused everybody to pause. As for Rosalba, she was borne away lifeless by her ladies, and you may imagine the look of agony which Giglio casts towards that lovely being, as his hope, his joy, his darling, his all in all, was thus removed, and in her place the horrid old Gruffanuff rushed up to his side, and once more shrieked out, "Justice, justice!" "Won't you take that sum of money which Glumboso hid," said Giglio, 218,000 millions, or thereabouts. It's a handsome sum. I will have that, and you too, says Gruffanuff. Let us throw the crown jewels into the bargain, gasps out Giglio. I will wear them by my Giglio's side, says Gruffanuff. Will half, 3/4, 5/6, 19/20 of my kingdom do, Countess? Asks the trembling monarch. What were all Europe to me without you, my Giglio? Cries Gruff, kissing his hand. I won't, I can't, I shan't. I'll resign the crown first, shouts Giglio, tearing away his hand, but Gruff clung to it. I have a competency, my love, she says, and with thee and the cottage thy Barbara will be happy. Giglio was half mad with rage by this time. I will not marry her, says he. Oh, fairy, fairy, give me counsel. And as he spoke, he looked wildly round at the severe face of the fairy Blackstick. Why is fairy Blackstick always advising me and warning me to keep my word? Does she suppose that I am not a man of honor? Said the fairy, quoting Giglio's own haughty words. He quailed under the brightness of her eyes. He felt that there was no escape for him from that awful inquisition. Well, Archbishop, said he in a dreadful voice that made his grace start, since this fairy has led me to the height of happiness, but to dash me down into the depths of despair, since I am to lose Rosalba, let me at least keep my honor. Get up, Countess, and let us be married. I can keep my word, but I can die afterwards. Oh, dear Giglio, cries Gruffanuff, skipping up. I knew I could trust thee. I knew that my prince was the soul of honor. Jump into your carriages, ladies and gentlemen, and let us go to church at once. And as for dying, dear Giglio, no, thou wilt forget that insignificant little chambermaid of a queen. Thou wilt live to be consoled by thy Barbara. She wishes to be a queen and not a queen dowager, my gracious lord. And hanging upon poor Giglio's arm and leering and grinning in his face in the most disgusting manner, this old wretch tripped off in her white satin shoes and jumped into the very carriage which had been got ready to convey Giglio and Rosalba to church. The cannons roared again. The bells pealed triple bob majors, and people came out flinging flowers upon the path of the royal bride and bridegroom. And Gruff looked out of the gilt coach window and bowed and grinned to them. Phoo! The horrid old wretch! End of section 52.
Section 53 of the Junior Classics Volume 9, Stories of Today. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. The Rose and the Ring by William H. Thackeray, Chapter 19. And now we come to the last scene in the pantomime. The many ups and downs of her life had given the Princess Rosalba prodigious strength of mind, and that highly principled young woman presently recovered from her fainting fit, out of which Fairy Blackstick, from a precious essence which the fairy always carried in her pocket, weakened her. Instead of tearing her hair, crying and bemoaning herself, the fainting again, as many young women would have done, Rosalba remembered that she owed an example of firmness to her subjects, and though she loved Giglio more than her life, was determined, as she told the fairy, not to interfere between him and justice, or to cause him to break his royal word. I cannot marry him, but I shall love him always. Says she to Blackstick, I will go and be present at his marriage with the countess, and sign the book, and wish them happy with all my heart. I will see, when I get home, whether I cannot make the new queen some handsome presents. The Crim Tartary crown diamonds are uncommonly fine, and I shall never have any use for them. I will live and die unmarried like Queen Elizabeth, and of course I shall leave my crown to Giglio when I quit this world. Let us go and see them married, my dear fairy. Let me say one last farewell to him, and then, if you please, I will return to my own dominions. So the fairy kissed Rosalba with peculiar tenderness, and at once changed her wand into a very comfortable coach and four, with a steady coachman and two respectable footmen behind, and the fairy and Rosalba got into the coach, which Angelica and Bulbo entered after them. As for honest Bulbo, he was blubbering in the most pathetic manner, quite overcome by Rosalba's misfortune. She was touched by the honest fellow's sympathy, promised to restore to him the confiscated estates of Duke Padella, his father, and created him, as he sat there in the coach, Prince, Highness, and first grandee of the Crim Tartar Empire. The coach moved on, and being a fairy coach, soon came up with the bridal procession. Before the ceremony at the church, it was the custom in Paphlagonia, as it is in other countries, for the bride and bridegroom to sign the contract of marriage, which was to be witnessed by the chancellor, minister, lord mayor, and principal officers of state. Now, as the royal palace was being painted and furnished anew, it was not ready for the reception of the king and his bride, who proposed at first to take up their residence at the prince's palace, that one which Valoroso occupied when Angelica was born, and before he usurped the throne. So the marriage party drove up to the palace. The dignitaries got out of their carriages and stood aside. Poor Rosalba stepped out of her coach, supported by Bulbo, and stood almost fainting up against the railings, so as to have a last look of her dear Giglio. As for Blackstick, she, according to her custom, had flown out of the coach window in some inscrutable manner, and was now standing at the palace door. Giglio came up the steps with his horrible bride on his arm, looking as pale as if he was going to execution. He only frowned at the fairy Blackstick. He was angry with her, and thought she came to insult his misery. Get out of the way, pray, says Gruffanuff hotly. I wonder why you are always poking your nose into other people's affairs. Are you determined to make this poor young man unhappy? Says Blackstick. To marry him? Yes. What business is it of yours? Pray, madame, don't say you to a queen, cried Gruffanuff. You won't take the money he offered you? No. You won't let him off his bargain, though you know you cheated him when you made him sign the paper? Impudence! Policeman, remove this woman, cries Gruffanuff, and the policemen were rushing forward, but with a wave of her wand, the fairy struck them all like so many statues in their places. You won't take anything in exchange for your bond, Mrs. Gruffanuff, cries the fairy, with awful severity. I speak for the last time. No, shrieks Gruffanuff, stamping with her foot. I'll have my husband, my husband, my husband. You shall have your husband, the fairy Blackstick cried, and advancing a step, laid her hand upon the nose of the knocker. As she touched it, the brass nose seemed to elongate. The open mouth opened still wider, and uttered a roar which made everybody start. The eyes rolled wildly. The arms and legs uncurled themselves, writhed about, and seemed to lengthen with each twist. The knocker expanded into a figure in yellow livery, 6 feet high. The screws by which it was fixed to the door unloosened themselves, and Jenkins Gruffanuff once more trod the threshold off which he had been lifted more than 20 years ago. Master's not at home, said Jenkins, just in his old voice, and Mrs. Jenkins, giving a dreadful yoop, fell down in a fit, in which nobody minded her, for everybody was shouting, Huzzay, huzzay, hip, hip, hooray, long live the king and queen. Were such things ever seen? No, never, never, never. The fairy Blackstick forever. The bells were ringing double peals, the guns roaring and banging most prodigiously. Bulbo was embracing everybody. The Lord Chancellor was flinging up his wig and shouting like a madman. Hedzoff had got the Archbishop round the waist, and they were dancing a jig for joy. And as for Giglio, I leave you to imagine what he was doing, and if he kissed Rosalba once, twice, 20,000 times, I am sure I don't think he was wrong. So Gruffanuff opened the hall door with a low bow, just as he had been accustomed to do, and they all went in and signed the book, and then they went to church and were married, and the fairy Blackstick sailed away on her cane, and was never more heard of in Paphlagonia. And here ends the fireside pantomime. End of section 53. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. End of the Junior Classics, Volume 9, Stories of Today, compiled by William Patten.